Welcome to everyone to the third and final webinar in the series hosted by Africa Tikkun. My name is Gary Lubner. I'm, for those of you who've been on these before, I'm chairman of Africa Tikkun here in the UK, and I'm talking from London. I'm also chief executive of a business called Belron, which operates around the world and which is a big supporter of Africa Tikkun. And this evening I'm joined by two, if not three, very, very impressive people. Firstly, I'm absolutely delighted that Nicola Golombek is joining us, actually from the Magaliesberg, where she's zooming with a view, as she said. Nicola, for those of you who don't know her, is quite a unique individual. She's a change leader and a social innovator, an award winner. Last year, she was awarded the Skoll Award, a very, very prestigious award for her work with Harambee for social entrepreneurship. She sits on the Global Yellowwoods Holdings Board and is responsible for a number of things, including their social impact work across the whole portfolio. She's had an amazing background, which she might touch on as a filmmaker, as a consultant, being involved in regulation, in education, a business entrepreneur. She was a Fulbright scholar, and she also, amongst other things, holds an MA from NYU. Nicola, a big, big welcome to you. We also joined this evening by Mark Lubner, who hopefully all of you know, the Chief Executive of Africa Tikkun in South Africa, someone who has done so much for so many people over so many years. You heard from him at our first webinar, and it's an absolute delight to have you here, Mark. We're also hoping to be joined by Benny Ngwama, who is the founder of Weka, but unfortunately, Benny hasn't managed to join us. I think we're having some connection problems. So when he does, and if he does join, I'll introduce him there. I think, as you know, the purpose of these series is to talk about philanthropy, technology, and the Holy Grail, which is the quest for equality. And over the last 2 weeks, we've had a number of really, really great speakers, ranging from Christopher Holder in the first week, through last week to Suzanne Ackerman and to Izzy from Founder Vine, where we heard their experiences. And this week we're focusing very much on entrepreneurship from a youth perspective. And genuinely, I'm not sure we've got anyone better qualified than Nicola to talk about that. And so perhaps, Nicola, if you don't mind just kicking today's webinar off, is to talk a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind, and just talk about some of your experiences in terms of the work that you've been doing, with particular focus on how it's been working in the areas around social empowerment during the lockdown, during this crisis, and perhaps share some of the learnings that you've had, and we'll then evolve from there. For those of you watching or involved in this webinar, please send in your questions as we go, and we'll try and answer them as through the webinar. The last thing I'm going to say, well, that's not true, but one of the last things I'm going to say is we are absolutely going to be finishing within the hour. So this is not going beyond 7:30 UK time or 8:30 South African time. I also noticed from some of the participants that we've got a lot of people from the US. So good afternoon to all of you. And depending what time it is there, we'll be definitely no more than an hour. So Nicola, over to you. You've got to unmute, Nicola.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks, Gary. Sorry for that. I hope that my connectivity in the Magaliesberg serves us well. If not, I might put my video off, so just let me know if my sound is deteriorating. It's lovely to be here, and thanks for that very generous introduction. I mean, I think you've said a lot about me, so let me rather respond to your question of, you know, what has the last 4 months held? And as you would have told, you know, would have got a sense from the introduction, I've experienced the sort of COVID pandemic in the last 4 months through, I think, three main, perspectives. The one is as a holding, as a director of a holding company of businesses in restaurants, insurance businesses, ecotourism businesses, and across multiple markets. Our businesses are all born in South Africa, but are now global multinationals. Certainly people in the UK will recognize Nando's and
very much
Compare the Market and other big UK brands, which are some of our businesses. But so, experiencing the world through just understanding the impact and the choices facing business, around how we live our values through a crisis like this. Our businesses are founded on the philosophy of inclusive and sustainable growth. And we take our shared value philosophy incredibly seriously as shareholders, and as do our executives. And so this has been a time where those values have been tested. I'm very pleased to say I think our businesses have all done incredibly well to have really demonstrated the muscle of their values, how it's built into the DNA and the way that they've responded, how you respond to your people first, your suppliers, your customers, their needs, and how you try and respond in a way that obviously sustains business survival, but also really thinks in a shared value way, even through a crisis. So that's been one lens of this last period. The second lens has been through our social innovation and social enterprise portfolio. And there, Harambee Youth Employment Accelerator is one of those, but we've actually incubated and continue to be very closely engaged with several others, large social innovation initiatives and social enterprises that we've incubated in this field of early childhood development, in the field of education system performance, and the one I'm here to talk most about, which is really youth labor absorption and youth participation in the economy, as a sort of key vector of inclusive growth in a South African context, given that youth constitute such a huge portion of our population and are so disproportionately unemployed and locked out of the economy. So that sort of social innovation and social enterprise portfolio is a sort of second lens through which I've been able to understand and had to respond to this crisis. Fortunately, many of our social enterprises are very enterprising. That's part of the DNA, and have a very sort of entrepreneurial culture, even though they're not for profits, and so have been able to pivot and respond and be quite agile in this time, both in terms of deploying their own capacities to pivoting from the work that they were doing to work that was relevant and useful in the context of the pandemic. I can give examples of that if people are interested. And then also to, really doubling down on, if necessary, restructuring, if necessary, doing everything that businesses do, but doing it at social enterprises, making sure that they are sustainable, making sure that they have a compelling value proposition into the future, and also sort of adjusting their strategy to basically match the new reality. In the economy, there's been a rebasing already. And so in a youth employment initiative like Harambee, you have to then rebase your entire kind of youth employment strategy in that context. But so I'm happy to share some more specific examples on that, but that's been like a really interesting journey, is just watching these organizations responding. And by and large, again, I'm pretty much, pretty excited, and many of them have found opportunity in the crisis, which I think has been a really important lens. And then the third, I suppose, feature of this period for me is we in Yellowwoods, we talk about, being a catalyst for change through our businesses, through social innovation and enterprise, and then through leadership capital and, social change leadership. And this was an opportunity that sort of came to us in this period to exercise that kind of leadership, because my colleague Adi Enthoven was asked by the president to serve as the deputy chair of our Solidarity Fund. And the fund was sort of born effectively sort of 2 days before our national lockdown. And I sort of like just naturally kind of, because we're all Adi and our partners and we just kind of muck in where we need to, I sort of like arrived on the first day to sort of help set up the organization. And you know, it's 4 months later, we've raised about 3 billion rand. We've committed about 2.5 billion of that already. You know, procured PPE for the country, provided food relief during the month of the economic lockdown, provided, you know, funding additional beds and, you know, so all sorts of things. I mean, you know, ICU beds and you know, expanding testing and making sure the country could access reagents. And so I've been very busy doing my several jobs over this last 4 months, but that's all what's been involved. So that's me. That's the last 4 months on my watch.
You've just described, I think, what some people do in a lifetime. I mean, that's quite incredible. I love the three lenses of the business, the big business, the values, the social enterprise, and then the support to government and the state. So we'll come back to that. Now, while you were talking, I'm delighted that Benny Ngwama joined us. Benny's based in London, and he's our other panelist this evening. Benny is the founder of an organization called WEKA, W-E-K-A, which is a tech platform that brings Africa to the world, or we like to think that it brings Africa to the world. So they're very entrepreneurial, investing in startups, small companies from the African diaspora and around the world. And Benny's, again, one of these people who's been fated as one of the, in Britain, as amongst the top 10 best Black students in the UK, as well as a winner of a Silicon Valley immersion program. He's absolutely passionate about technology, Congolese born. And so I think it's going to be really interesting, Benny, and you weren't here for the very beginning, but perhaps if you wouldn't mind just sharing, I mean, very bluntly, how's lockdown been for you, in particular around WEKA, and how's it changed the model, if at all? What are some of the experiences? What are some of the learnings that you've had? And a big welcome to you, and thanks for joining us.
No worries, Gary. Thank you very much for your very big gracious introduction. So lockdown, actually for me, Gary, lockdown was very positive. I think going into it, there was a panic, especially from a business perspective, given that WEKA is an investment platform and investment sentiment wasn't the best given the pandemic. However, we were really shocked and really humbled to see how the community, especially African diaspora, were able to rally around the cause. You know, the cause essentially of WEKA, and WEKA is actually Swahili. It means to put away. And essentially what we want to do is change the narrative when it comes to investing in Africa. You know, change this perceived lack of transparency, and also show that there are amazing businesses that are emerging from this incredible economy. So funnily enough, Gary, we were able to launch the business officially during COVID. And wow. We were able to complete, 2 investments during this time. So yeah, that was very, very humbling from a business perspective. From a personal perspective, I actually took the chance to do some things that I didn't think I would have had a chance to do if things were, I guess, running as normal. So things like learning how to code, things like, I guess, taking better care of my health, and also picking up a new language. So I think when you have all this free time, you kind of think, what can I do? What's there to do? And so it's a good chance for me to kind of take a step back and really look into the stuff that I've always wanted to do and actually really get to it. So yeah, all in all, Gary, for me, lockdown was a good time to pause, and actually quite effective from both a business perspective, but also from a personal perspective.
Yeah, fantastic. So one of the things that we've been talking about on these discussions or on these webinars is the role that technology can play in terms of changing the paradigms that we set with. So I'd be interested to know, certainly, Nicola, I hope you listened to, or you came in enough time, sort of represents the broad spectrum, both from very big businesses through to social enterprises. But I'd be interested, Benny, maybe first from you in terms of how is technology, or how can technology help both big business and the smaller ones, the entrepreneurial side, the startups, to perhaps overcome things that we didn't even realize existed until this crisis?
I think tech can play a massive part, Gary. I guess I can maybe start with my background. So my background, I was born in the DRC in Congo, during the time where there was civil war. And then I came to the UK, and, growing up, as I did my studies, my parents would always send money back in terms of remittance. So this would be for people to eat, go to school, and etc. And actually, my mum came to the UK before we did. So she'll send money back to us for school and etc. And then when I came, I started working at Barclays, and it was kind of my turn to kind of take the mantle and start sending money back to uncles and cousins, etc. And during this time, I realized effectively what I was doing was perpetuating this dependency cycle, where those back home were kind of expecting a payout or a paycheck from those living abroad. And at this time, there was this whole new wave of fintechs. So these were kind of small startups leveraging technology to make finance more accessible, easier to use, etc. So the likes of Revolut, Monzo, and these companies were making transactions across borders a lot more seamless and a lot cheaper. So that's actually how the idea of Weka came about. Was, you have this diaspora group who send about 40 billion worth of money back to the continent. However, for the past couple of years, that hasn't actually done much in terms of development for the continent. So, I thought, is there a way for us to use the technology to actually turn this huge amount of economic capital to actually spur development in the continent? And in terms of my background, I saw opportunity whereby we can use technology to channel this capital into small businesses, thereby helping those on the ground essentially help themselves. So, technology in that sense has played a huge factor from, connecting two groups of people, but also playing a massive part in development of the continent. So when it comes to access, when it comes to ease, but mostly I think for me it was when it comes to accessibility. So technology really helps to break down barriers, lower costs, and etc.
Great. Yeah. And I mean, I can only echo that as sort of someone leading a big business. And and I've said this before, slightly embarrassed actually, because what we've realized through the lockdown is how close we have 30,000 people around the world. And I never thought you could ever get to everyone. Well, the truth is you can. And technology is the way you do that. And you can get messages across, and you can be consistent, and you can do all of the good things. So certainly for me, it's been a complete eye-opener how technology, I mean, the fact that we just sitting here,
the fact that
from all over the world. And,
exactly.
I mean, it's amazing. So Nicola, I mean, you've seen sort of both bits of the spectrum. So maybe you wouldn't mind just commenting a bit on technology. And sorry, just to focus a little bit. I mean, the work that Harambee and you guys, I know, have done some really good partnering with us at Africa Tikkun as well. And I'll ask Mark to comment on that in a while. But maybe just particularly around technology, how it's been helpful and how it can be helpful maybe in the future.
Thanks. So, I mean, I think Benny's given a great perspective already from a sort of entrepreneurial and kind of market development perspective, and sort of, I think that the role, of technology in driving, economic opportunity, whether it's, new enterprise opportunity because you can reduce cost, increase efficiency, increase access. So I'm not going to repeat all of that. I think if I look at it, maybe just to add some dimensions from the Harambee experience that would be of interest. So I think, so maybe just to explain that Harambee always was envisaged as a labor market solution rather than a sort of a project in a sense. And you know, it's so we always set out to try and solve this kind of really important problem in the labor market, which is that you have and I mean, bizarrely, even now, even as we experience economic contraction and economic and low growth, there are areas of the economy where there is demand that is seeking skills that do not necessarily require graduates, but do require people with skills and experience and work readiness, we call it. And that mismatch in the South African economy was actually an inhibitor to growth in the economy, but it was also a key reason why young people find themselves locked out of the economy. We've got a poor education system that's very unequal and a very poor signal of talent. And you also have a history of overinflating education in South Africa. So the only currency in the economy is education, and yet only 25% of South Africans actually ever enter higher education post school, and many who do that anyway don't complete or don't, you know. So you have this kind of all these mismatches in the economy that really perpetuate systemic inequality and lock a huge talent pool of young people out of the economy, even in areas where those skills are tremendously needed. And ironically, and I'm going to use this example because it's such an opposite example for this conversation, is digital and tech, right? Where it's one of the, I mean, entry-level digital roles in South Africa is one of the few areas that through every cycle of our economy, demand way outstrips supply, right? So we just don't, I mean, a great inhibitor to our economy is that there are just not enough people ready for those roles that are needed across, and I don't just mean for the tech sector, I mean across banking and retail, and you know, every industry needs these skills, right? So this mismatch was the one we set out to tackle, and I think that we've done sort of 3 different things with technology in tackling that problem, or technology has been a key lever to us being able to solve that problem, not just innovatively, but at a national scale. So the first innovation is new ways of credentialing young people. So breakthrough solution, what AI and technology has enabled us to do is find new ways to assess and signal the potential of a young person that isn't an educational qualification. And that's been absolutely key to disrupting the normal recruitment practices and the normal qualifications framework that actually traps both employers and young people in this sort of perpetual mismatch. And that's a really important disruption, because most of the government financing, and in fact private sector financing, and all the incentives in our economy for hiring inclusively and or for skilling people are driven by this qualifications framework. And this qualifications framework is so exclusionary and such an inhibitor to talent, and so and to human capital development. So really what we've been doing with tech is building a new platform for profiling and assessing and effectively creating a new kind of wallet, a new kind of credentials wallet for young people, a new currency for how to signal their capacity in the labor market, and really have spent you know, several years winning that currency as a currency with employers. So partnering with hundreds and hundreds of employers, both to spec those credentials, but then also, and those attributes and qualities, so that it's very data, you know, it's all based on empirical data, and it's, you know, it's validatable. So a data-driven approach to credentialing has been one innovation. And I think that's a really important one, because I think the world over, this is a really important issue, as not just for equity, but actually for relevance. I mean, the fact that the Silicon Valley companies don't use qualifications anymore, is not really about, it's not only kind of, it's not just driven by their sort of impact goals, right? It's driven by the fact that they just don't see the education system as a good signal of potential, right, in their world. So I think that there's this real sort of area of innovation and disruption around credentialing. I'm going to broadly call it that. The second is obviously then, if young people do need to then close their gaps. So when they've been assessed around their work readiness, they will have gaps. I love Benny's way he's used his lockdown, and I'm extremely jealous that you've had the time, Benny, to pick up a language. But I really hope that my time will come. But what's interesting in your example is what we found when we did assess the gaps that young people have, the last thing they need is to be sent to a university. What they need is to fill a particular gap that they have, right? A very common one is they've been sitting at home unemployed. They have not been practicing their English. And most jobs in the labor market today in African countries require, well, not most, I mean, that's a big overstatement, but the formal sector jobs in a lot of, certainly in South Africa and a lot of other African markets, depend on competence in spoken English. Like, I mean, the basic, call center jobs, tech jobs, all sorts of jobs, right? Retail jobs, customer facing jobs, require a spoken English competence and confidence, which eludes these young people when they live in communities where no one really is speaking English and they're unemployed, right? So just an opportunity to practice your English, and practice your English, right? Not learn English in a university, but practice your English can be an absolute game changer in your employability. And, if you think about how tech can enable that, and how simply tech can enable that, actually, without, all the institutional trappings, that's another example. So a lot of the innovation has been about solving these kinds of what we would call closing gaps. Yes. That are very functional gaps for people to close, or in Benny's case, gain something that I want and I haven't been able to have. And so I think this whole breakthrough in tech-enabled learning, but with a very behavioral focus. So I think one of the things that we've been really, really focused on is the motivational and behavioral elements of learning rather than the content of learning. Content is infinite. There is so much content on the internet. No one could ever make any more content. If it may not be relevant, but part of making it relevant is it's a curation exercise and a behavioral exercise. So we focus a lot of effort on that. And then I think that the third really important, I mean, I just want to signal. So I mean, Benny's spoken about tech as an aggregator of opportunity, tech as an enabler of opportunity. I mean, we've seen a lot of the new kinds of, we're trying, I suppose, to focus on not gig work, because I think that most poor young people can't manage that. I mean, it's not feasible in a life that moves day to day from a point of view of cash flow. And connectivity. I mean, connectivity is our sort of biggest issue in South Africa. So if we're talking about what struggle needs to get solved, it's the cost of connectivity and access to connectivity in South Africa, which is still incredibly unequal and low. But so one of the things we've been focusing on, which is a sort of another tech idea, is to think about tech itself as a new economy in which young people have a particular advantage in terms of their participation. Young people have a comparative advantage in terms of being able to participate in that economy. Even the unions are not really contesting it in the way that they are in other sectors. And so we're really doubling down on this acceleration of young people's, especially young people from poor families, access to tech skills at the entry level, because one of the things, I mean, obviously we're trying to address the digital divide in that process, but we're also understanding that young people, if they can just get in anywhere, the workplace will be where they will learn, whether that is a workplace, a formal workplace, or just a work opportunity. So those are, I don't know if that's a helpful basket of things.
Incredible helpful, and a huge amount of food for thought. And I think plays perfectly, Mark, if you wouldn't mind commenting, because I think this sort of brings a whole lot of things together. So certainly the technology, but also how NGOs, organizations like Africa Tikkun, which at the core of its model is from sort of cradle to career. And I know a lot of the work, Mark, that you're doing in South Africa is getting young people ready, listening to people like Nicola around specific skills. But maybe you could just share some of the challenges or some of the opportunities that you've seen, and from an NGO perspective, because we've heard a lot from an entrepreneurial point of view. So Mark, will you're on mute, so can you just unmute yourself? And we've got lots of questions coming in as well, and I'm watching the time, so we're going to try and move it on. Mark, sorry.
Yeah, no, thanks very much for that. I mean, it was almost the perfect introduction. Yeah. You know, listening to Nicola talk about the marketplace from a demand perspective, essentially, and equally hearing from Benny, who talks about once competent with these skills, what the opportunities necessarily are from an investment perspective. The Africa Tikkun approach is to turn around and say, recognizing that those are the demands, how can we from the supply side necessarily satisfy the opportunities? We believe that labor is a key component, a key ingredient in any business. So if what we can do is match competencies with and skills with the appropriate attitude to go into jobs which individuals particularly would like to be involved in, you've got a productive outcome. So in essence, what we did starting at a very early age in our preschool activities, we already introduced the basics of computing. Our 7-year-olds, 6 and 7-year-olds are already introduced to the world of coding, recognizing that if we can overcome that fear of what seems to be a distant tech environment, we already start to create a fertile environment in which the children and youth can then develop their competencies and skills. And then just talking very quickly about some of the tech elements, Nicola referred to this matching of individuals for work experience opportunities. It's no good taking somebody who has got a great sales competence, for argument's sake, and sitting them behind an accounting desk. So it's an ability to be able to use AI to be able to assess individual competencies, both hard and soft competencies, and then match them to the work experience programs that organizations like Harambee are in fact affording. And we do work, in fact, very closely, I'm pleased to say, increasingly so, on some of the presidential initiatives as well, to try and get as many individuals into jobs for which they are well suited. And that component for jobs for which they are well suited, we think is a key component that has been lacking for many, many years. So not only have we got poor unemployment statistics, we've equally got lack of productivity as a result of the mismatching of these competencies and skills with people's attitudes and wants. So the challenges that we do face is, as you can appreciate, in these environments, internet connectivity, Nicola was referred to earlier on, access to hardware. You know, not every single young individual has a smartphone that gives them access necessarily to the data that's needed, and the cost of data is also very expensive. So what we're trying effectively to do is to look for solutions by partnering with other organizations within the various communities to maximize our reach. So from our centers, for argument's sake, we've started actually using Wi-Fi connectivity to send out data around school curriculum. Let's accept that the school education system, government education system, is poor, it's lacking, and it needs bolstering. So a lot of the data that we're hoping to actually be able to get out is we combine with teaching of teachers in the environments that are surrounding our centers, so that we can effectively uplift a broader community than just necessarily provide the service to kids coming to our centers. This marriage, Gary, of the demand side and the supply side, I think is more pertinent now than ever before. We can't rely on a government system of education to provide the competencies that we're looking for. Private sector and the NGO world have to collaborate a lot more closely together. And there are models globally. If you look at the German guild model, where companies like BMW invest early on in the identification of talent and then the breeding of that talent, as it were, the supporting of that talent until they actually find jobs within organizations like BMW. We need to do a lot more of that. And that has to do with crossing between the haves and the have-nots in ways that we've not necessarily done up until now. COVID and the lockdown has brought that to the agendas, to the top of the agendas for a lot of us.
Mark, thanks. Benny, I mean, just building off that, one of the, and we've got a few questions that are coming in, or a few comments, which I think are absolutely spot on here, that one of the issues that could be is that the sort of gap between rich and poor grows because of the lack of technology that people have. And so actually technology sometimes can be growing the gap. Have you seen in the sort of, I know you deal with, you know, a number of different African countries and with entrepreneurs, etc. Have you seen anything good that's going on, which at a basic education level, which allows young kids access to technology, even in a really difficult situation, as Mark said, where they don't have internet access, or they don't have a laptop, or they just don't have ability to do that? Have you seen anything that we could copy in South Africa, or that we could learn from? Benny, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. I think EdTech, so that's using tech in education, is definitely a kind of booming area of business or area of tech. But actually, the lack of technology is something that I myself personally have experienced as well. So, being born in Congo, when I was there was a period, where I was out of school for about a year. And I love the question the person asked about, for someone who hasn't got internet connection, you have all this new innovation, whereby, you have Zoom, you have one teacher teaching 100 students, but that there are some prerequisites that someone should have in terms of tech to access these new innovations. And I think, thinking back when I was around 7 and 8, there was none of these innovations. So I guess to a certain extent, I missed out on the benefits that we've spoken about regarding tech. So then the issue that arose was the issue of last mile. So, you have all this new connectivity, you have these new kind of tech and AI, machine learning, etc. But the main issue in Africa is last mile. How do you get this kind of tech into the hands, into the doors of the most remote of individuals, or the individuals that don't have the necessary tools to absorb and actually, engage with that tech? From the companies that we've spoken to, companies that we've tried to invest in, what they've tried to do is essentially address that last mile issue. Because like you said, simply talking about the benefits of technology, simply talking about new innovations doesn't actually help or aid kind of bridging that gap between rich and poor. So yeah, most of them actually address the last mile issue. So when it comes to some of the businesses, Africa is becoming one of the most connected online community in the world. And there's huge mobile penetration. So, most of these companies, what they're doing is they're trying to find ways whereby they can leverage the kind of content that Nicola spoke about and getting it in the hands of students or individuals who might not have internet connectivity, or who might have intermittent connectivity. That means that they have connectivity certain hours of the day, or not continuously like we get to hear. So what they do is they're able to send content, through the network, wherever someone can access it in their own time according to their speed of connection. So, these are the ways whereby, again, I reiterate the point about access is really trying to get tech into the hands of those that might not have it. And that whole issue is about addressing the last mile. And that's across most businesses, not just education, but financial services, deliveries, information is really getting into the hands of those that don't have the tools to access it. And those are the most effective businesses, you know, in terms of methods, in terms of how they do it. You know, I think there's still a huge gap, still a huge demand for companies to kind of work that out.
Nicola, just building off that, in particular on the point of access, particularly in South Africa, where, I don't know, I'm told by one of our participants that 80% of kids are without laptops or computers at school. So what role can business or NGOs play in this whole issue around access, which I agree with Benny is the key thing. If we haven't got access, then the rest really doesn't follow after that.
I mean, obviously, you know, I mean, there are different kinds of NGOs and different kinds of responses. I mean, you know, the issue around access is first and foremost a set of political and regulatory decisions. So, you know, rather than about the provision of of some hardware, right? So, I mean, you know, because, you know, a lot hinges on connectivity as opposed and as Benny says, consistent and high bandwidth, you know, connectivity, right? Everyone's got a mobile phone, but the average airtime balance of South Africans, you know, is R1, right? Right. So I mean, you know, and even if you know, in most feature phones, you know, we have a Mobi site in Harambee, and I mean, there's nothing that Harambees can access beyond our Mobi site. I mean, they just do not have the money for data. They don't have, you know, there is Wi-Fi, and they'll go to the library sometimes, they'll go here and there, but it's very intermittent, very limited public access from a Wi-Fi perspective. So these last mile issues that Benny talks about are very prevalent in South Africa. In fact, more so because our data is more expensive than in Kenya, for example, or in other parts of the continent, Ghana. So, you know, so I think access is like a really, really huge issue. And again, I mean, you know, the things that have held it back are largely about corporate and political, you know, interests and conundrum, the things that usually hold us back, right? In every country of the world, right? And leadership and other things. So I mentioned this because the one thing, you know, we have, you know, it depends what kind of NGOs we're talking about, but obviously social justice NGOs and NGOs focused on advocacy work. I think there's, you know, very powerful roles that those kinds of NGOs play in an issue like this. And certainly people who have experience and influence and leadership capital, either because they've been in tech companies or they have credibility with, you know, with people who might be running tech ministries. These are important roles to play, because I can tell you, if you talk about an unlock,
yes,
if you talk about a small thing to get done that has a massive multiplier, this would be it, right? But getting it done, as I say, is not about delivering some computers. I mean, that's not what getting it done looks like. We're talking about millions and millions and millions of South Africans who need access to connectivity, right? So that's just point number one about the ways to think about the world, which we think about quite a lot. The second one is, I mean, obviously, you know, to the extent that, you know, one has a sort of philosophy of change that is, you know, well, let's create a demonstration effect. Let's do something that works, and hopefully the government or, you know, big corporates or something will scale this stuff up, right? I think the limitation with that model is that is two things. NGOs can often design solutions that are unscalable, in fact, right? So they're just designed for, you know, I mean, they said, you know, the world is littered with successful pilots, and the reason for that is that things are designed to work well at one scale and then can't work at another scale, or aren't designed to work at a national scale. And I don't just mean the way they operate. I mean the way they're designed in terms of who owns them, who drives them, whether the state can operate them, whether they work within a public system, whether they're designed for application by the real teachers that exist, not the ones we wish we had, or, you know, those kinds of things. So So I think that a lot of the challenge that NGOs face in the space, and in fact, I think private education has faced in the space, private education that is trying to influence the public system. We have some examples of tech-enabled private education initiatives in South Africa. Several of them now, quite successful in their own right as enterprises. But their intention was to try and influence the public system. And that shift from being an NGO doing good work yourself to actually having an impact at the scale at which these problems exist is, in our view, the most important provocation I want to make to NGOs. Because I think if we aren't thinking at the scale of the problem with the resources and intellectual capital that these kinds of NGOs and the group like this of very smart people have, then our response is disproportional and kind of inappropriate to the speed at which the problem is coming towards us. So I don't know if that's helpful, but those are my thoughts. And technology should help us with that, right? But then we've got to think in that way.
Yes. So I think it's very helpful. Mark, sorry, did you want to come in on?
Gary, if I can, I'm so pleased that Nicola raised that again, because Nicola's absolutely right. One of the biggest obstacles to integrating efforts is, a lot of the ego that's tied up amongst NGOs. And forgive me if I just do a quick plug for Tikkun. We just signed an agreement a few months ago with the Department of Social Development to take essentially what is our IP, this concept of developing children from early infancy all the way through to careers, and now rolling it out on a national level. The only way that we're going to make a success out of it is through partnering with organizations like the Harambis and various other organizations to say, together we can take that concept of early stage development, marrying supply and demand together, and take them from one geography into the next geography into the next geography. I couldn't resist, obviously, the plug, because the solution has to be, how do we grow this to scale? And only once we build it to scale will government really, in my opinion, come behind it and give it real clout, give it real support.
Yeah. I think well said. Guys, I'm watching the clock, unfortunately, and so we're sort of heading towards the end of this webinar, which I must say for me has been absolutely fascinating. So we're in the middle of COVID, and sadly, the more you read, we may not even be in the middle. We may just be in the beginning. We're hearing in Europe now again. If you would have, anyone in the UK will have heard about the Spanish situation. Melbourne and South Africa, I don't have to tell anyone the issues that's going on there. So this is here to stay, and I think that means a number of things, one of which is there is no going back to normal. It's going to be going back to a new normal or an abnormal. And so maybe just in closing, each of you, if you wouldn't mind just reflecting, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this, but just for you maybe to reflect, what do you think, and let's leave it on a positive note, what do you think the positive things that the COVID crisis is going to leave us with in the new abnormal? I don't know, Benny, do you want to maybe start? You're on mute, Benny.
Again, rookie mistake. Gary, I think what this new normal will teach us is the element of resourcefulness. I think the need for us to do certain activities, the need for us to keep going forward and moving on, in a context whereby we have to learn new skills, or we have to adapt to achieve these goals that we're used to doing, or to achieve greater things. It means that this whole current environment, will push a lot of people to be more resourceful, to think of new ways to achieve certain results. So in that sense, I think that could be something that's quite positive, and it's something that I personally myself consider a challenge, but also a challenge that can only bring about good. I think this desire to move forward, to keep going, is something that can be repressed. It's just now a case of finding new ways to do it. And we as human beings have always been great at finding ways to innovate and moving forward. So I think that's one possible negative, so positive element of COVID, pushing us to be ever more resourceful.
Fantastic. Benny, thanks. And I mean, you the living proof of that. So someone who's learned how to code a new language and done some things. So thanks for leading from the front. And I agree with you. I think the level of resourcefulness that we're seeing around the world as a result, necessity has made people resourceful. I think is going to make the world a better place. So Nicola, how about you?
So to add to those, to build on Benny's point, I mean, I think, I think it's different in northern, in some parts of the world, I think people are going to have rediscovered the importance of governments.
Yes.
And in my part of the world, hopefully people are going to realize that actually they can't rely on government that much. And, these are sort of the strange dilemmas of a time like this. I think, what's the silver linings? The silver linings, other than we're going to, be resourceful, I have to say, my experience of particularly poor people is that they're endlessly resourceful, but we're doubling down on that, I suppose. But I think, so what would my hope be? My hope would be that the climate emergency will benefit from people having understood what an interconnected system looks like. I think people have finally understood that we actually are in an interconnected system, that you didn't really understand that a pandemic was also an economic crisis, and now you do, right? So there's something about understanding a system that is almost become a bit more obvious to people that I think might have not understood or focused on that before. So I'm hoping that climate sort of in some ways could benefit from this in the way that people think about the world. And I would hope that, because you're going to have such a major disruption of the existing economy, particularly, certainly in the part of the world where I'm from, we're going to have such an economic disruption now in the formal economy. It might break open new opportunities for the people who've been excluded to participate in some new economy that has to form. And whether that is an informal economy that might benefit women more, or whether that's a tech economy that might benefit young people more, there might be different winners and losers. I'm not sure that net everyone's a winner, because this is going to be a really brutal time for a long time. Yeah. But as we go through a brutal time, who comes out the other end more having won and more having lost? Maybe I can only hope that women and young people might be better off. I mean, I know that they're right now experiencing going backwards in the north, but that doesn't mean those patterns are not the same in a place like ours. So, let's see what happens.
Mark, in the last minute or so, your hopes for how this is going to change?
Yeah, Gary, I think that there's going to be a new consciousness. I think that this has shown that no matter whether you're rich or you're poor, you're subject to the vagaries of things like pandemics. And poverty has become very much more real. It's no longer just poverty, seeing people on the side of the road that you can give $5 to, and that's going to resolve, your conscience or make a material change. So I think what's going to happen is going to be a lot of fast tracking of initiatives that deal with poverty. Secondly, quickly, I believe that a lot of the youth who are experiencing lockdowns, COVID, the integration of health, economic, social issues, who will be the decision makers in the next decade, will come from this background with a very different approach to the decisions that they're making as to how this world is going to be run. And that gives me huge optimism, because there's a much greater sense of sensitivity than necessarily my generation, who maybe the decision makers at the moment, who really were focused around trying to amass wealth rather than necessarily share that wealth.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, and thank you to the three of you. I think this ends on a really positive note, and I think it ends our webinar series on this whole thing about the fact that we can all work together, we can work in collaboration, whether that's NGOs, big business, entrepreneurs, startups, but it has to be an ecosystem, I think, as Benny said. It has to be joined up and it has to be thought through. For me, as we end this and sort of having lived through this crisis, I think it's back to what Nicola said at the beginning. It's connecting back to our values, connecting back to our purpose. And our purpose isn't about making more money. Our purpose has to be about making a difference for as many people as we can. Yeah. And I think unashamedly, Mark, you said we are going to put in a plug for Africa Tikkun, because Africa Tikkun is an organization that is making a difference for thousands of young people in South Africa. And the model that you have developed in South Africa is something that can be replicated and hopefully scaled. And so for those of you who have been on all of these webinars, or if you've been on one or two, and you feel like you would like your money to go to a cause that is really, really worthwhile, please do so. Be generous. We're doing lots of things at Africa Tikkun. We're feeding people on a day-to-day basis through this crisis, but at the same time, we're also trying to build capability, competencies for the years and for the generations ahead. So to all of you, particularly to Nicola, to Benny, to Mark, thank you for joining us this evening. Thank you for your brilliantly wise words. For all of you who've joined us tonight or in previous times, a big thank you to all of you. And let's hope that maybe one of the hopeful things coming out of this COVID crisis is we can meet more regularly on these kind of platforms and forums, which we didn't even think about before. So thanks very much to you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
My challenges during this lockdown is that I don't actually have internet, don't actually have smartphones and laptops or computers to learn at home, and the signal at home is actually weak.
I am Jessica Kekana. I live at Alexander Township and I attend the CYD program at Africa Tikkun.
If I could actually have internet at home, I could actually learn more on what I want to be in the future, learn more about lawyers. I'm Anez Mabunda. I live in Alex Township. I'm a CYD learner in Africa Tikkun. Africa Tikkun actually has a big open space for me to actually learn there.
If only I could have access to resources like tablets or phones that can equip me with knowledge of pursuing my dream of being an environmental engineer.